Retired Navy Admiral Tim Gallaudet just did a 1-hour interview on the Big Thing podcast, and he said some pretty interesting and substantial things coming from someone of his stature and pedigree. He is a retired Rear Admiral of the U.S. Navy. Tim has held high positions in the government, in 2017 being confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere within the U.S. Department of Commerce. He was also the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and the Acting Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, NOAA. Tim has been one of the few military professionals with high standing who has spoken frankly and outright in support of UAP transparency. He's vouched for David Grusch. Tim stands out to me because he actually makes some firm statements rather than taking a kind of neutral, well, we're still trying to figure out what these are kind of stance. And that's pretty significant to hear from him. Also, it's reassuring to know that people like that are apparently working behind the scenes on this. Tim says he's, quote, totally convinced that we're experiencing a non-human higher intelligence, possessing craft that can do things that we can't explain, with technology we can't explain, with laws of physics that are not what we know them to be. I'm completely convinced because I know the people that were in the government programs that oversaw both the crash retrieval and the analysis of UAP data. We are working as a team behind the scenes to advance disclosure, a controlled disclosure, as was put forth in the Schumer Amendment. Big words from Tim. He's essentially going on the record officially saying he knows people personally that were in government programs involved with UFO crash retrievals. He wouldn't be saying this publicly, someone with his stature, if that wasn't true in some very big way. So that's pretty significant. They asked Tim what he thinks of the recent ARO report, which denied any evidence of extraterrestrial UFO crashes or beings in existence in any government or military programs that were involved in UFO crash retrievals. The report denies any evidence of that. Tim weighs in on this by saying that the Pentagon, quote, has decided that information should remain classified and unacknowledged. So the unclassified story is there's nothing there. He says, I know that to be a fact. And that, quote, we do possess material and more data that the government does not want to disclose for national security reasons, but we should release to the public the awareness that we are being visited. We should have an informed public. I think they should have been a lot smarter in how they approached that report. This could, quote, lead to a dramatic disclosure event with the whistleblower protections that exist in a way that's going to be out of control for the DoD. Tim Gallaudet weighing in on the ARO report. As he mentions there, the whistleblower protection laws, that went in place right before David Grusch came out. This context, I think, is missed a lot in this story and how it all logically makes sense, at least from one perspective, that David Grusch came out in early 2023 because the NDAA right before that had solidified new whistleblower protections, because before that you couldn't come out with things that were that top secret. Grusch went through the whole process, step by step. The Inspector General of Intelligence passed his case through, stamped it credible and urgent, all that. So I think that's not what people are really talking about, because the media hasn't done a good job at covering this, or anyone, politicians, whoever's supposed to speak and people are going to actually take seriously, even though those people have spoken too, military people, people like Tim Gallaudet. And that may be the case, that with the whistleblower protections, more whistleblowers come forward, more like Grusch, with direct firsthand knowledge. But we haven't seen this happen yet, and why not? Also of note that they briefly touch on is with Tim Gallaudet obviously being a Navy Rear Admiral and having a specialization in the oceans and USOs, and he's looking into leading the cause on investigating UFOs in the oceans, USOs. They do briefly touch on the fact that David Grusch, and in his investigation, 4-year investigation with the UAP task force, a lot of the people he spoke to were Navy people. And if you listen to Grusch and some of the podcasts he's done, such as the Joe Rogan episode, he spoke about how it was Navy guys who first told him some of the craziest firsthand accounts that he never heard of before. Tim is asked about disclosure timing and if it's ever going to happen. Tim says, quote, "It's going to come out in our lifetime. It's just going to take a little more time legislatively." Tim also goes on to talk about how his experience working at a senior level in the executive branch at the Department of Commerce, he said that he saw how the system works between the president and the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, which, remember, RO is just an office in Department of Defense. The Pentagon, which is part of the executive branch, is under the oversight of the president. He says from his experience that the DOD has to stick to the policy line that's coming from the president ultimately, from the president to the National Security Council. National Security Council gives out the policy, and as he says, quote, "They've made this very clear that this is how policies and authority flow in the U.S. You don't get out of lane or you lose your job." Another interesting point made is that data and evidence of underwater UFOs, USOs, is kept by a third-party DOD contractor that Tim is, quote, "pretty sure he knows who it is." So that's some insight into where is evidence held, and it just makes so much sense. I mean, if you were trying to keep something secret or classified, it would be the smartest thing to do. You make it private. You give that evidence to a private company and a contractor, and they are not held accountable to the FOIA laws or actually being investigated, unless, of course, it's a criminal lawsuit, which some have spoken that that's one of the options that can be used in this whole thing. But it's just interesting to think about that. That's probably where all the best evidence is in private contractors' hands, not in government lockers, even though there's stuff there too, apparently. Enough to have disclosure. For example, Danny Sheehan going on the record testifying to RO that he was in the National Archives documents from Project Blue Book and he saw a picture of a crashed UFO in the snow somewhere and Air Force people standing around it. He just said this publicly on a Ross Coulthart News Nation interview a week or two ago. But he also testified this under oath to the RO investigation. They talk about the possibility of disclosure coming about by one big leak of undeniable evidence. That's one way it could possibly come out. Tim also mentions classified acoustic evidence of USOs that's kept at Johns Hopkins that he says he wants to be able to study. When asked if Tim knows any of the 40 whistleblowers that David Grusch has cited in his whistleblower claims, Tim says that he, quote, knows people who know the 40 whistleblowers. Tim gives a warning potential delay for disclosure could be any kind of military conflict that the U.S. could get involved in, and the UAP issue would take a back seat. He also makes a point earlier that the president does not want to disclose right now. And so that's why that policy going to the Pentagon, to the ARROW report, has to stick to that line. And the reason, very simple, why Biden wouldn't want to disclose now is the election. It's an election year. I mean, something like that is just a huge variable. And of course, it would be a simple strategy. Hey, at least get it past the election. So I don't know if that means maybe we don't have hearings this year. How much do the hearings reveal? How much do they affect the election? I think that people are going to want to have some kind of hearing before next November, some kind of thing, a follow-up to the July hearing. That's got to happen. How will that impact the election? How will the presidential candidate's response to that impact the election? Another point Tim makes in the closing segment here is that James Lasky, people haven't focused on this much, James Lasky and his book that came out in October, where he said that they got into a UFO. They actually studied a UFO. He went through the whole approval process, through the Pentagon, of all of that. He is who he says he was, and who he was the director, head physicist and director of the AWSAP program, which was a 2008 to 2010 $20 million Pentagon-funded study into the UFO phenomenon. I thought that was a pretty substantial little bomb when he dropped that book, and I actually have a few videos on that. The book's pretty interesting to read. They did a bunch of scholarly, peer-reviewed physics papers on how UFOs work and all that stuff, and he does say, it's just one sentence, but it's his little disclosure, I guess, that they actually went into a UFO, and nobody really talks about that. Nobody speaks about, okay, let's get this guy, should be one of the people that is subpoenaed. You were the director of 2008, 2010, yes. Is it true that you went into, that the government had possession of a UFO? Yes. Right, he's under oath, he's subpoenaed, he's protected by all the laws. Okay, boom, right? Step one, there should be people like that in this next hearing. It would be so logical to just investigate this with hearings and have the truth come out, but I'm sure there's a whole lot going on behind the scenes we have no idea about, even with higher intelligence, non-human intelligence, as Tim Gallaudet puts it. In closing, Tim also explains why he's so-called lone admiral on this. Someone with high rank in the military that's able to speak about it like he does. He says because he was never involved in the issue, never had to sign any NDAs for it, and he just happened by chance to see the Go Fast video a little bit before it came out publicly. And it's good that people like him can speak about it, and he might be a little wrinkle in the system, lucky chance that he was in the right place at the right time and is not restricted to speak about it. Because, I mean, he says point blank, as we noted earlier, he's completely convinced, because he knows people who oversaw crash retrieval programs. He's totally convinced. Not it's a possibility or some other term like that. Totally convinced that we're experiencing a non-human higher intelligence. And just a final closing fact that Tim cites is that, yes, only 5% of the ocean has been explored, 95% has not been explored, and only 25% of the seabed has been mapped. So that means 75% of the bottom of the ocean's seabed is completely unknown. Of course, what that would mean for USOs, underwater anomalies and craft, and potential bases deep under the ocean, at the bottoms of the ocean or underground in the bedrock. We know that the Navy has studied this since the 1960s. They actually had the technology and the capability of doing this and had a whole detailed report exactly how to do it in the mid-1960s. So there's a whole lot of questions. Of course, we got more questions than answers, but I think the real takeaway here is Tim stepping up to bat, making strong statements that this is real, right in light of that RO report just coming out. He's putting himself on the line. Much respect to Tim. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully things will keep moving in the right direction. I don't know if it's maybe a good thing with the election season coming up, the UAP issue. How are they going to jive? That's what we'll have to really look out for. But the needle's got to move forward to some degree. I don't think it can totally stagnate until the election. We'll see what happens. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.